Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Daniel Feldman, and we are going to be talking about a really exciting and has wide implications kind of sugya called the sugya of haramos, the sugya about circumventions in the halachic system, to which I know Rabbi Feldman momentarily will be telling me we shouldn't be calling it circumventions. But before we jump into it, for those who are not yet familiar, Rabbi Daniel Z. Feldman is a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan at Yeshiva University, as well as an instructor at the Saisim School of Business, and has taught for the Wurzweiler School of Social Work and the Katz School of Continuing Education. He also serves as the executive editor of the REITs initiative of the Yeshiva University Press. Rabbi Feldman is the author of many works, including The Right and the Good, Halacha and Human Relations, Divine Footsteps, Chesed and the Jewish Soul, False Facts and True Rumors, Lashon Hara in Contemporary Culture, as well as 5 volumes of Talmudic essays entitled Bina B'Sfarim, which have been published with the approbations from many Gedolei Yisrael. Rabbi Feldman is the Rav of Or Sadia of Teaneck, New Jersey, where he resides with his wife Leah and their children. And as we say in rabbinic parlance, Miksa Shivcho Shel Adam Omer B'Fanav, there's a lot more to say about what Rabbi Feldman has accomplished, but today's focus is going to be on his latest work, which is, for those who see it on the video, or you'll take my word for it, called Letter and Spirit, Evasion, Avoidance, and Workarounds in the Halachic System. And rather than focus, because how could we possibly limit ourselves to talking about one single tshuva in such a wide-ranging and important sugya that has so many ramifications in halacha, I asked Rabbi Feldman that perhaps he could give us a little bit more of an overview of the nature of haramos in halacha and some of the salient teshuvos that address it throughout the centuries. So Rabbi Feldman, maybe you want to tell us just a little bit about your sefer for a moment. Tell us about the thesis of it and what kind of topics are addressed. And then we could jump into some of the juicy tshuvos that you cite. And I should say one more thing, by the way. When people hand me new Sfarim to read, and I have many congregants who are kind and tell me that I should read this book and that book, one of the first things I do to assess a work, not the only thing, but one of the things is I immediately scan the pages to see the footnotes, because it's very important to me to see that good research was done. And I have to say, I was not disappointed at all whatsoever. The first thing I noticed was the immense depth and breadth of Rabbi Feldman's research, which we've all come to expect. And that's something that has made this a very edifying experience. I'm still in the middle of reading the book because, Baruch Hashem, there's so much content. Perhaps there'll be, we should issue a spoiler alert to our listeners who also might be in the middle of it as well. Without any further ado, Rabbi Feldman.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be here. And let me also emphasize just how much I love the title of the podcast.
I have to give credit to a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Dr. Sam Singer, who's also a listener on the podcast. I put it out on Facebook a while ago. I'm like, guys, help me figure out a title for this. And shoot first, ask questions later. So I have to quote it B'Shem Amro. I'll let him know, or maybe he'll be listening and he'll respond.
Well, it's a pleasure to be shot by you over here this morning. And thank you for your kind words. And part of the challenge of this topic is the name. You have a great name for the podcast, not a great name for the subject. And it's very challenging for a number of reasons, because any name you're going to use for this subject is going to be a little bit judgmental and biased. And in addition, it assumes that all of the subjects are in the same bucket. And that was a part of what I tried to address, and is probably not really accurate. So whatever name we use really reflects more the perception of the subject rather than the actuality of the subject. And hopefully by the end of the book, which you haven't reached yet, we hopefully have somewhat of a different impression. But whatever word we do use reflects rather the impression rather than the actuality, hopefully.
Right. And maybe just give our listeners who haven't seen the book yet just a few concrete examples. I know they're actually split into case studies in the chapters. What are some concrete examples of haramos, circumventions, or workarounds, or whatever term we want to use, which I know you addressed at the beginning of the book that there's no good English translation for it. What are some of the concrete examples where we see this in halacha?
So the subjects that the book covers include, probably most well known is mechiras chametz, the selling of chametz before Pesach.
Mm.
A related subject would be the heter mechira, the selling of land in Israel before the Shemitah year. Maybe even more well known, which is related to that, or certainly an older concept, is the prosbul, to prevent the cancellation of loans at the end of Shemitah. The heter iska, to allow profiting from funds that are provided for business purposes, ideally, despite the prohibition of taking interest on loans. That was very carefully phrased.
Yeah.
The shtar chatzi zachar, to allow equal distribution of assets in wills, despite the way the Torah dictates how inheritance should take place. Things like that.
And there's also, I think you get to an especially modern example of the prenuptial agreements, halachic prenup, that many in Rabbinical Council of America university circles are promoting.
Right. And that actually is a very important chapter to me. And a part of why that's included, and you refer to spoiler alerts, it's intentionally the last chapter, or almost the last chapter, because certainly that's a question that many people wonder about. That given that they're familiar with all of these other devices, mechanisms, whatever we want to call them. So then, and given that we're familiar with the agony of the contemporary Aguna and the frustration that we have in trying to address that situation, so the question is so often asked, if we can find solutions to all of these issues, how come we don't have an easier approach to dealing with what is so clearly a wrenching problem? So
Right. If I
the
could find ways to save some money and not throw out my chametz before Pesach, one would think at least achas kama we can find some way to make things work that a woman doesn't have to remain trapped in a dead marriage in perpetuity.
exactly.
So right, and certainly you address that there. But let's like rewind a little bit. Those are some of the or many of the issues that you focus on in the Sefer. What would you say is the overall thesis? Because I think something remarkable about your Sefer is that it's an entire book dedicated to this issue, though there's so much literature that has come beforehand. So what were you seeking to do in addition to collating the massive amount of material, which already I'm sure is a great feat unto itself?
So I wanted to try to give a framework in order to appreciate just how these things are addressed, somewhat of a formula, so that one could understand and maybe then predict why it is that these different mechanisms or approaches that really don't necessarily all belong in the same breath, in the same sentence, why it is that they get such varied reactions and responses, and why it is that some of them are widely accepted, some are perhaps greeted with a very hostile reaction, and some get very mixed responses, and some really depend on the implementation. So why is it that there is such a varied response? And often the reaction is, well, if you can do this, why can't you do that? Or if this is okay, why is this not so okay? And to try to give somewhat of a framework to be able to appreciate why that is. And I think if one does look at the details and one does come with somewhat of a framework, then it does actually fall into place and it does make sense. But one does have to prepare with that kind of an appreciation and a respect for the system. And if you have that, then it does fall into place. I mentioned there the joke that they say that the rabbis are going to prohibit smoking, but the Orthodox Jews aren't worried because they'll sell their lungs to a non-Jew. So
I remember I mentioned to you, but our listeners might not be aware. So I conduct one of the atypical shiurim. It's more of a book club I conduct at the shul. We're going through it right now, and we got to that line. Everyone got a good chuckle at that one. That woke everybody up. Something else I enjoyed also was some of the weaving of what we might call Torah Mata into the Sefer. I think you gave an example in American jurisprudence of the difference between tax evasion versus tax avoidance, and how lahavdil, there's a very similar kind of discussion there about me choosing to take a non-toll road for an extra few minutes rather than taking a toll road is tax avoidance, which is legal, and even they might want you to do that to lessen traffic on heavy roads, versus tax evasion, which is covering my license plate so that way I don't get charged the toll. That would be illegal. And the question is, what about all that gray area in between?
Correct. So there's a lot to try to figure out about how things should be categorized and how different approaches should be reflected. And there is a history of the literature here. So one of the main goals is to appreciate how things fall into place, and therefore also to understand what can and can't be done. And therefore also the Aguna issue should also be understood with that kind of introduction and a background. So the placement of that chapter at the end hopefully should come after a significant grounding in all of the issues. But I do feel also that the halachic prenup has emerged as a very strong tool to address the issue in a very affirmative fashion. And there are arguments that can be made that support it that perhaps haven't even really been made yet. And that within the context of the formula that's discussed in the book come out even hopefully more clearly. So that's also
So with
part of
that, actually, maybe you can articulate for our audience. I think perhaps one of the I haven't finished the book yet, so I'm sure there's many more. But I think one of the greatest contributions of the Sefer, in addition again to the collation material, is the thesis of the Sefer, which I think. Tell me if I'm misreading. I think the central thesis of the Sefer is that there are four different factors in assessing the legitimacy of any workaround, and each one kind of pulls on the other one. And maybe you just want to tell our listeners about that.
Correct. So I think there are these four factors that come into play, and it's basically a test that can be applied to every one of these mechanisms or devices, for true lack of a better word. And each one could score differently depending on how you look at it. And the aggregate of all of the scores is going to impact how the reception plays out. So first is the question of the letter of the law. If it doesn't pass that test, it's really going to be a non-starter. So we first have a commitment to the observance of halacha. So we have to assess, does this pass that test? Is this acceptable as far as the basic letter of halacha? Now,
Right.
that itself is really a two-part test. So that could have counted as one question or two, but it's really a two-part test because the first question is, does it work? Does it accomplish what it's claiming to accomplish?
Did you
So,
actually transfer, let's use Mechiras Chametz, did you actually transfer ownership to the non-Jew legalistically?
well, actually, that may be a different question. So
Oh, okay.
let's use for example the question of the heter mechira might be a better illustration.
All right.
So the first question might be, so does it actually accomplish removing it from the restrictions of Shemitah? So if
Mm.
I do sell land to a non-Jew before Shemitah, would that actually accomplish removing the prohibitions of Shemitah?
Ah,
So does it actually accomplish the halachic goal or not?
meaning does it give me the end result that I desire, that now this land can be worked during the seventh year?
Correct. So
Okay.
does it actually satisfy the letter of the law?
Okay.
But when I say it's a two-part question, so that's a particularly relevant example because there the controversy actually had two components to it. And the
Mm.
second part was actually perhaps more intense because even if you were to agree that that part does work, in that situation, there was a stronger controversy about a second aspect of it that maybe you could agree that it does do that, but is it permissible to do? Because
Ah,
many objected maybe even more strongly to the heter mechira on those grounds that, okay, maybe it works on that basis, but there should be a prohibition to sell
of lo
land.
sechanim, of selling the land to a
Exactly.
non-Jew. You're not supposed to
Exactly.
sell land of Eretz Yisrael to non-Jews.
Correctly.
Right.
Correct. So the Chazon Ish was very upset about that, and many others. The Nitziv has a tshuva where he writes that Torah prohibition is the more serious issue than Shemitah, which many assume, not necessarily him, but the advocates of the Heter Mechira all worked off the premise that Shemitah today is a rabbinic obligation.
Ah.
So he said it's a bigger problem to sell land than it is to violate the laws of Shemitah. So he said he
Yatsa schara
advocates
behefsedo. It's a net loss
exactly.
halachically.
So
And for
he
those
wrote
keeping score at home, we just refer to a tshuva and a tzif. I'll
exactly.
have to put that citation in the show notes if we could get that.
Right. So he
Um,
wrote that it's like running away from a lion to encounter a wolf, or the other way around. I always forget which animal is more dangerous in the market. But it's running away from one problem to get to a worse problem. So this basically that first step is two parts. So it does it work halachically, and even if it works, is it permitted to do? So some might say that even if it's functional, it may still involve other halachic
kind of like
problems.
every action has a reaction. I don't know if this is true, but this is like, at least the Bubba Mice I was told, and maybe it is true, that in Eretz Yisrael they had a huge rat problem. So the reason you go to Yerushalayim and there's cats everywhere is because they brought the cats in to deal with the mice or the rats, and now there's a big cat infestation problem in Yerushalayim. I don't know if that's actually how it happened. Maybe that is, but it's that same issue, which is you plug one hole and then the water spurts out in another direction. So that's true. So that's point number one, which is the letter of the law. I think there were three other
Correct.
points. The formulation.
Right. So the next question has to do with the spirit of the law. And that's really where often the biggest issue comes up, and the
Okay.
whole concern of evasiveness that often bothers us and that often leads to cynicism, which is one of the main goals of the book, is trying to prevent cynicism, which is so corrosive and does so much to undermine religious commitment and sincerity. So that's one of our main purposes, to try to fight off cynicism,
Mm.
which, not to be too extreme about it, but Rav Hutner's classic essay in the beginning of his Sefer on Purim, he identifies with Amalek, but
Oh wow.
the so that's
Yikes.
pretty bad. So the idea of the spirit of the law is pretty crucial, and according to the Ramban and a few places in his commentary on Chumash, it's a mitzvah daraisa to make sure that you're in sync with the spirit of the law.
Right. This is the classic Kedoshim to you that there's the
Kedoshim
meta
Tiyu,
halacha
and
as
Vasis
well.
Hayashir V'Hatov,
Right.
and which was the title of my first book. And
Uh,
so
oh, the
that
right and the good. Okay. I didn't in
right,
my mind turn it into Sisei Shavato, but that makes sense.
right.
So
So we certainly believe that's important, and that's often where the issue is. The often is the feeling that, okay, yes, we did satisfy the letter of the law, but let's be real, isn't this really getting around what the Torah really wants?
right, because the issue is you're going into Tame Hamitzos territory.
Hmm.
And even those, perhaps most iconically, the Sefer Chinuch himself, even when he posits the Tame Hamitzos, he says, Misharshe Hamitzvah. Here are some possibilities. So determining the spirit of the law is very fraught because we don't know necessarily all the reasons of why God commanded a certain mitzvah. So once we start playing that game, now, the art, I try to naturally I'm biased. I defend the rabbinic establishment when we have these conversations at shul during this year, but I would argue who is most well situated to intuit the will of the Torah. This is the Das Torah argument, which is not Das Torah that I asked the rabbi, should I enter into this business? Should I invest in that stock if there's no halachic implications? But if I'm trying to understand the will of the Torah, chances are someone who is Vagisa Bo Yom Valayla, who's sitting and learning Torah day and night, they're most likely from their psyche to produce the will of Torah rather than me, Moshe Kurtz, who learns a little bit, plays some video games and does administrative work and, does all sorts of other things with his time. But that's a point that you make throughout the book, which is it's a little bit fraught because one has to know the spirit of the law to then ask the next question of whether we're in violation of it. So that's point number two. So we have the letter of law, we have the spirit of the law. Those two I definitely, was familiar with before coming in. I think the next two add an additional layer of nuance. You want to tell us about that?
So the third one is similar to the spirit of the law, but a different spin on it. And that is, for many of these devices, we are representing that we're doing something. So let's say in the case of Mechiras Chametz or Het Mechira, so we're representing that we're selling the land or selling the Chametz. Or in the case of, let's say, the Heter Iska, we're representing that we are, instead of lending the money, we are investing the money in a business venture. So then the next question to ask is that really happening?
Mm.
So is the sale sincere? Is it actually a sale? Or is it what might be termed a sham?
Right, because even on Heter Iska documents, and even if we use terms like interest, we don't mean interest. We just mean that it's an investment. And just
Correct.
take a look into Nachla Shiva at the Maharam's language that I've never looked at in my life, and that's what I'm relying on. And it seems very perfunctory and disingenuous.
So that would be the third question, and that's sometimes a whole different test. So how sincere are we that what we are claiming to do with this new approach is actually happening? So just to go back to that joke about the selling of the lungs and what's the problem with it? So you could look at it from the perspective of the second question and the third question. So as far as the spirit of the law, you could see why it fails, because if the issue with smoking is that it's not healthy, so selling your lungs is not going to help. It's not going to be any healthier when you sell your lungs. So
Uh,
even if there was a technical prohibition of smoking that you could somehow address by selling your lungs, it wouldn't do anything for the spirit of the law because you would get just as sick. But also from this third issue, it's also relevant because what do the words mean to say you're selling your lungs? You're still going to walk around with your lungs inside of you for the rest of your life. You're still going to be breathing through those same lungs. So the non-Jew who purchased your lungs, can he sell them on eBay? Can he charge rent? How is he in any sense the owner of them? So it becomes a meaningless idea. And that's
mm,
actually a sugya, it's a Mishnah in the Darim. It's a discussion that any sale that has no practical meaning is not called a sale. So there's such a thing as a sham transaction, which has legal definitions also for tax purposes and the like, that there's a question of a meaningless transaction. So that becomes the third test here. So when you are claiming that you're selling something, you're claiming that something is an investment rather than a loan or whatever it is we're talking about. So is that real or is that just a sham? Is that fake? So that becomes the third test,
mhm.
the third issue. And that becomes a major factor in a lot of the literature.
Right. And I guess that brings us to our final factor.
Right.
What's
And the
number four?
final
The
factor.
grand reveal.
Right. So the final factor is also very important that given that it's rare that you're going to get a perfect score on all of the first three questions. So why do we want to take on these questionable activities? So presumably there's some kind of pressure, there's some kind of need. And the greater the need, the more you can tolerate some kind of weakness in the first three areas.
Mm.
And the stronger the score in the first three areas, the less of a need that you have to have in order to undertake it. So the balance here in your score is going to depend on how they
How
all
extenuating
interact.
the circumstances are. The
Correct.
greater degree of shas and chak you're in, the more you're willing to bend backwards and do some sort of halachic acrobatics to find a das yachid tucked away somewhere in some sefer that no one ever heard about, to rely on in a very crazy kind of situation.
Well, in general, that's true. In general, we say that b'shas adchak, so we rely on a das yochid that you mentioned, things like that. But here, so that's already from the Gemara. The Gemara says kedai
Right. Shas
whoever
and chak
l'smoch
done.
b'shas adchak, something like that. But here, within this context, so we were talking specifically about this formula. So we're assuming that the reactions that these devices get is based on the combination of these four factors. So we can tolerate a higher score, we can tolerate a lower score in one column if there's a higher score in the other columns. So they all play with each other. So the greater the need, the more we can tolerate a lower score in the three first columns, and vice versa.
Right. So this is a very helpful overview. And so let's shift from the abstract to the concrete. What are some, and again, there's so many makoros to pick from that I hate to make you be mitzamsem, but what are some really salient and important sources, particularly around the tshuva literature, though not limited to it, that we should know about this sugya? There's the Bechor Shor, which I think you referenced toward the beginning, and what else? What else should we know about?
Well, the Bechor Shor was hugely influential in the whole subject. Mechiras Chametz is often cited as a, I guess, kind of flagship issue, as a representation of the whole issue, and kind of stands in for a lot of it, took a lot of the heat, and represented a lot of the topic. But Bechor Shor became very influential in that he posited, and many agreed, many disagreed. In some ways, he still maintains an influence on how the issue is processed. That he said, harama, whatever we mean by that word, and that's still a big question. But whatever harama means, and we'll see that harama is really unclear. Harama could mean at least four different things. Harama could mean a workaround. It could mean a deception. It could mean a evasion, or it could mean just an alternative, which doesn't have any kind of judgment
and
involved.
and the challenge is that many poskim are seem to operate on different definitions of the term
Correct.
harama.
Even when engaging
So
with each other, even when talking to each other.
even when they're engaging with each other,
Yeah,
they haven't defined their terms, which could lead to a little bit of confusion, perhaps.
correct. Right, and Gemaras are not necessarily working off the same. And just in Chumash, it's a huge issue, and or in the Rishonim, it's an issue that they point out that there's a citation from the Rambam that distinguishes between the word mirma and the word harama, and then others point out, but then you have a problem with Chumash because Yitzchak says about Yaakov, Achicha ba b'mirma, and then is he accusing Yitzchak accusing Yaakov of something negative, and then there are those who posit that you have to assume Lashon Mishnah L'chud and Lashon Mikra L'chud. You have to translate Chumash and Mishnah differently, and it's very, very challenging. And there's a whole fight about
Even
is the
just
measure
the
there
simple definition of terms
is
is already complicated from the outset,
very,
which
very complicated.
in an already very confusing and fraught sugya doesn't start us off on a good foot.
Absolutely. So here the Bechor Shor asserted that in the context, and it's even this gets quoted in a way that gets distorted and kind of morphs and takes on a life of its own. But what he's quoted as saying, which is not necessarily an accurate quote, but because it took on a life of its own, we'll take the quote rather than the actuality of what he said. But the quote is not necessarily accurate. The quote is that Mechiras Chametz is a harama. Haramos are only acceptable when dealing with rabbinic law.
Huh.
And nonetheless, that's okay because our chametz, we're only dealing with dinim derabanan
Interesting.
because we do
So
bittul, and bittul
so
knocks it
the
down to a derabanan.
Right. So one of the which I know you cite in the book, one of the most compelling distinctions is that a mitzvah midoraisa, a biblical mitzvah, is an expression of God's will. You don't want to circumvent that because you're going against the Ratzon Hashem. But rabbinical, the rabbis are kind of just making safeguards around the Torah. So if you circumvent a rabbinical level mitzvah, you're not really in violation of a deeper Ratzon Hashem per se. That seems to
Right.
be
Just
one
to be
of the
clear,
main
though,
reasons.
I posited that as a theory to explain such a distinction, but that's not what the Bechor Shor means.
So what does he actually say then?
Right. So he's basing it on a Gemara, which does seem to draw such a distinction. But that's also because he's working within a very specific understanding of what a harama is. And that goes back to our definitions. It's also part of how
Uh,
things took on a life of its own,
oh
that
boy.
he was working off of harama as a sham,
Uh,
basically as a fakery, and that he thought that the sale wasn't sincere. And there are Gemaras that talk about somebody doing something specifically in the context of Dinim Darabanan, where for a Talmud Chacham, which was another condition that was also confounding in this context and wasn't brought into this discussion, and later Sfarim who argued on him pointed that out, that the Gemara says that certain Dinim Darabanan were permitted for Talmidei Chachamim who weren't suspected of violating the underlying Issa Daraisa to violate them because they were not going to be suspected. Probably the most relatable example is and many of the examples are very obscure, but there's a Gemara that talks about there's a prohibition to sail in a raft on Shabbos
mm.
because of the concern that you're going to come to fix or build the boat. So, but let's say somebody were to just lie down and take a nap in the raft, and then it would somehow sail across the river while you're taking a nap. So the Gemara says that Talmid Chacham, who's not suspect of actually violating the Issa Daraisa, he could create the impression he's just taking the nap and let it sail him across the river while he's doing that. So that is called in that context a harama in the Darabanan, that is
Right.
permitted to the Talmud Chacham.
And
So
there it's giving almost a prescription or a recommendation. So there,
right.
harama can't mean a sham because otherwise, why would a Talmud Chacham be engaging in that?
Well, it does mean so essentially it does mean a fakery. It means that he's misrepresenting what he's doing, but
Ah,
it's permitted because he's not suspected of violating the Issur D'Oraisa. So yeah, that only could make sense by a Drabanan. The whole point is that it's something which is not going to be a concern of leading to a violation of an Issur D'Oraisa.
right. So,
So
so just to, if I may, so it sounds like one important distinction is the biblical versus rabbinical level.
correct.
Another distinction that I know you cite Rav Shechner, Big Hatson, as well as others, distinguish between a positive versus negative mitzvah, vis-a-vis circumventing the negative mitzvah of retaining chametz of bayir balimatze, versus we still fulfill the mitzvah of tashbisu of actually burning the chametz on Erev Pesach. Let's do, just because we have only a few minutes left, a little bit of a rapid fire round. Are there any other key makoros that obviously we are encouraging everyone to, and I'll put the link in the show notes, people to purchase Rabbi Feldman's new sefer. But if someone were to just like walk away now from the sugya, what is something that they should, what else should they know about it? Any other makoros, whether it's a tshuva or something else that our listeners should know about?
Well, there's a lot. I think that really that really what emerges is the incredible dedication of rabbinic leadership throughout the centuries to try to guide their flock to a path of sincerity and adherence to the Torah in a way that allows the letter of the law to pass from one generation to the next in its totality so that it will be here for all future generations and that the Jewish people will be able to function at their highest level throughout. And it's really fascinating just to see how that comes out and the dedication of that rabbinic leadership, whether it's in the context of Mechiras Chametz, and there's some fascinating shuvas, and time doesn't permit to go into it, but I'll call your attention to shuvas of the Masas Binyamin specifically, and shuvas of Ramosha Feinstein, the Chelkas Yaakov, and Rabbi Kalatskin. And in the context of Ribis, again, the Chelkas Yaakov and the whole move for the Heteriska Klali and the Marash Engel and others, and the tremendous controversy that surrounded the Heter Mechira, but also some of what was written by Rav Kook and by the later chief rabbis of Israel and what they struggled with, and a
And
citation.
all these citations are in the safer, guys, for everyone listening. The
And I'll
citations are all
also
there.
mention something that's not, some full disclosure that's not mentioned there, that in
Ooh.
the context of the Hetzim Mechiras, I quote Reb Zvulun Leib Barit, who was actually my great-great-grandfather, whose yard site was last week. So that's a secret reference for your listeners. But
So much having
so
Ali and a of the learning.
thank you. 121 years. So there you see certain attitudes that I think come out that are very, very instructive. And there's a lot to learn just from that. And it could be that some of these devices are not for everyone. The Hatam Mechira, we said, is particularly controversial. And when it comes to Mechiras Chametz, there's many different versions that have been adopted. Some people sell absolute Chametz, some people don't. Some people go to a siyum during the 9 days, some people don't. And whatever you do, you should do what you believe in this context, in terms of these particular approaches. But to avoid cynicism should be a major priority, and to
So
recognize.
speaking of cynicism, I think there's kind of a phrase that's become ubiquitous, especially in modern Orthodox circles. Perhaps you have heard this: where there is a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way. And I think that's kind of either explicitly or subconsciously in the background of many people. And I just, as our concluding message with our 2 minutes we have left, what would be, based on your research, your response to that assertion?
So I think you do see a big glimpse into the power of the rabbinic will throughout, and just how intense the concern for the rabbinic will has always been there for the well-being, the spiritual well-being, the material well-being, the physical well-being of the Jewish people. It's always been there. And so anything that hasn't been addressed, it's not because of any lack of rabbinic will. That's important to address. And that our goal has always been to bring out the Dvar Hashem and to make sure that the Jewish people are able to reflect that in a way that is also consistent with all of these other considerations. And that's something which has reflected itself throughout the history of Psak Halacha, going from the Talmudic times till now, in ways which are really very inspiring and fascinating and have always been there. And that's something that I think we can look to as a source of continued strength, continued inspiration, and that we shouldn't think anything less. And I find also the whole discussion about Prus particular, which is so often misunderstood, because the impression people take away from it is that, oh, you can look to Prus and see that you could do anything. And that Prus is an example basically of how when the rabbis care enough, they could change anything. And there, the rabbis found a way to get around the Torah law of canceling loans because they wanted to help their rich friends be able to get their money back. And probably no part of that sentence is true.
They're
Probably
helping the poor for the most part.
they're helping the
Wouldn't
poor.
get loans otherwise.
Exactly. And it's probably not a Torah law. The Gemara already indicates that it's not a Torah law at this point, and that their main motivation seems already addressed in the Mishnah is to help the poor get loans. To the extent that it is to help the rich, it's to help the souls of the rich who shouldn't be considered sinners for holding back from helping the poor. But certainly the concern of Shalotino Delos B'fnei Lovin, which is on every other page of the Gemara, that we want to make sure that we want to preserve the ability of the primary directive, that the chesed of loans, which is represented by that idea. The mandate of chesed, of alachta b'drachav, is represented by loans in a very powerful way. So we have a whole cluster of mitzvos that are there to support that, including canceling loans in the Shemitah year and not taking interest. And it's possible that so many of these things, heteriska included, are there to make sure that the primary directive of helping people out is first and foremost attended to. So it's just one more example of that tapping in, as you pointed to, of the real intent of the Torah and making sure that that's preserved. And to be able to appreciate that first and foremost is one of the major goals of what we try to bring out here.
100%. And, I would just reiterate as well, when we talk about the rabbinic will, I would like to think it's not the rabbinic will of like Joe pulpit rabbis like Moshe, like myself, Moshe Kurtz, saying, I want to do X, Y, and Z. But the idea is we have kind of like Gedolei Yisrael, we have Chachamim who are, Osek B'Torah 24/7. And, we would hope that that's the kind of will that we are looking to. But certainly this is a super complicated topic. And I know
Well,
you've gone to lengths to clarify it to the best of your ability. So I just want to, was there one like very brief thing?
well, I would also add that about rabbinic wills, there's also a chapter about inheritance.
Good play. This is why I brought Rabbi Feldman on. We truly brought you on for the puns.
Well, a
You
lot of
put
people,
the rest of us rabbis to shame.
Well, a lot of people that also have a chapter about embarrassing people in my first book. So, but in terms of rabbinic wills, a lot of people have commented to me that they found that to be something that they've wondered about a lot, the whole question about inheritance, because that's an area where our practice seems to completely deviate from what the Torah dictates. And not only that, but rabbis today wholeheartedly endorse that practice of completely deviating from what the Torah has seemingly recommended or commanded rather. And so that was a topic
Well,
which
you know what? We just have to tell our listeners if they want to learn more about that, we're going to put Rabbi Feldman's Sefer Letter and Spirit in the show notes. And with that, I know there's so much more to say, but Baruch Hashem, Rabbi Feldman has written a Sefer on this topic. And thank you so much for coming on Shoot First, Ask Questions Later to share your wisdom with us. And Hashem should just give you continued hatzlacha to keep pumping out so much Torah for all of Klal Yisrael to benefit from.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.